Hello everyone, my name is Master Steve, and welcome to some World of Tanks Blitz. So I want to start looking at some of these Tier 8 and just pretty much all the premium tanks in the game and see how they still hold up, because now that the game is 10 years old, I really just want to see, do a lot of these still hold up. So we're going to be starting with what I believe was, this is like the first Russian premium tank ever added to the game. I think the first actual premium was the T-34 Tier 8, or it was the Snowstorm Jagdtiger. But this was, I know this one was the first Tier 8 premium Russian tank. And when it first came out, this thing was an absolute beast. It truly was all you saw at Tier 8. I remember, when this game first started, Tier 8 was dominated by pretty much the IS-3, you had the IS-6 occasionally, and it was just a very different meta back then. So now, today we have, just a stupid amount of Tier 8 tanks. I think it really feels like they're adding a new Tier 8 premium tank every 2 weeks. I can't even keep up with how many there are. I own most of them, but there are still some you run into where you're like, I've never even heard of that before. So, as I said before, when the IS-6 first came out, it was the king of its tier. This thing was awesome. And now, over the years, it has received a lot of changes. When you look at the tank now, it does have 2 guns for you to choose from, and other than that, it's pretty much stayed the same. I know the armor has gotten a slight buff to it, but that's pretty much it. So the armor itself is kind of where I would say this tank doesn't exactly hold up as well as it used to. It is still definitely a good tank by all means. It's still very fun to play, and it's still, it's still a good viable option at Tier 8, just not what it was. So the armor itself on the front is, it's not the thickest. It's like 110 millimeters thick on the front, or I think it's like 110, I think something like that, 150 on the turret, I believe. And, that's not bad by any means, but now we have so many of these new vehicles at Tier 8 that have such amazing penetration to where it doesn't really matter. A lot of the new tank destroyers, like the Chinese ones, you have the Italian TDs, they can absolutely shred this thing, and it was never really that bouncy to begin with. When you're trying to come around a corner in this thing to attack an enemy vehicle, you're always going to be showing something that's kind of relatively flat. The way the corners on this thing line up, when you're coming around there, you're always presenting a relatively flat target, and it is kind of thin. Now, I will say that, as long as you have some sort of cover to use, like in a city or, a dead vehicle, this thing will perform super well. The reload on the gun is not too bad. I don't have any modifications equipped because I like to just see how it is, totally baseline. And on the reload of 14 seconds, it's not too bad. It's just you do have to take into account that this tank is a Russian tank, and Russian heavy tanks all have the same issue for me with, you have your 400 alpha damage gun, and the accuracy really depends on the day and just the cycle of the moon, whatever. It's totally random. You truly have no idea where the shot's going to go, and sometimes you get super unlucky. There are times where you will not aim at all. It'll go totally straight, and there's times where you will, take your time, aim as much as you can, and that thing will still hit the dirt and you'll do no damage whatsoever. So you do have to consider that, yeah, you are dealing with a Russian gun on this tank, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. So ideally for this vehicle in this day and age, you still want to be playing it in, like I said, a city, anywhere where you have some decent cover, and you want to be making sure you're playing that mid-range. If you're playing too close to people, they're going to have a lot, an easier time to penetrate you, and if you're too far away, the gun is not going to have the accuracy for you to perform well in a game. Now, the tank does hold up pretty well against a lot of these new vehicles. I would tell you that, there's not exactly a line of tanks that has been released since this thing has came out. This thing can't really handle that well. Like the new Italian TDs, it handles very well. The new Italian heavy tanks, anything handles those well. Those are all pretty lightly armored. The Japanese tank destroyers, it handles them all pretty well, and it competes with them pretty favorably. So, like I said, it does hold up pretty well in today's game. The issue is that there's just so many more viable options at Tier 8. Like if I had to choose between the T-54E2 and this thing, I'd probably go with the T-54E2. And just looking at Russian tanks in general, I mean, I would still personally rather have an IS-3 Defender. I'd rather have the Object 252U. There are so many like different tanks for Russia at tier 8 that are premiums that, you know, they pretty much perform the exact same way this thing does, but they just have better armor profiles. Like the 252U, for example, has that very nice pike nose on the end of it, and the sloping of it is just better. It's just a far bouncier, easier tank to use, and it just feels like it holds up much, much better. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you should always take those tanks out over this thing. I do think the IS-6 still has a place. It is just not as prominent as it once was. And now, one more thing I do want to add about this tank are the weak spots. Now, I do remember when this thing first came out, this thing was pretty easy to get an ammo rack hit on. And after playing it for, I think I took this thing out for about 25 games before I, made this video, because I like to make sure that if I'm gonna, make any content about a vehicle, I, play it pretty well. I make sure that, I just play one and be like, oh, it's bad, whatever. And, I took it out. I noticed that, like, thinking back to when I first played it, I'm not having the same issues with the ammo rack that I was. It's not exactly as volatile as it once was, which is good, which makes it more viable. The thing that has never changed though is the weakness of the turret. Those two hatches right above the gun are still definitely weak and kind of easy to hit for some tanks that have some high accuracy. And I will say that, like, if you look around the gun on the front, just to the left and the right, those two cheeks next to the gun, those are super easy to hit and super thin. So it really is, I mean, it's a true Russian tier 8 heavy. It really depends on who you're up against and what day of the week it is, and just whether wargaming is going to let you have a good game or not. It truly is super, super random, and there's just not really a good way to predict how this thing's going to perform in any given game. You can still have some absolutely monster, amazing games in this tank, and it, I would say this one is still definitely worth picking up. You can definitely make a lot of good money in it and have a lot of fun, get a lot of bang for your buck. But the issue is that there's just, again, there's still so many other viable options out there. So I would say when this tank first came out, it was for sure an S tier vehicle. It was super dominant, awesome, and just super fun to play. And now, years and years later, I think it's probably been 8 or 9 years since this thing was released, I would say the tank is it's definitely no longer an S tier. I would personally rate it a comfortable B tier. It holds up well. It can do the role of a heavy tank in this game. It just has suffered from, there's so many other things added in the game now that are much more viable, and Russian heavies are not as dominant as they once were. They're all kind of paper thin. They're just not as strong as a lot of the other tanks in this game. So let me know your thoughts down in the comments down below. Do you think the IS-6 is still, the king of its tier and, still extremely dominant? Or do you also agree that this thing has fell off pretty significantly and is just a shadow of its former self, but still a relatively viable option? So, like I said, let me know down in the comments below. I'm curious to hear you guys' thoughts, and if you guys want to see more World of Tanks videos, please like and subscribe for more. And please, please, please let me know down below what premium tank we should look at next and see whether it holds up or not. Personally, I'm thinking the SU-122-54, but we'll see. So that about does it in this video. Go ahead and like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.